My name's Lucas Reed. I've been through some rough patches in my life, and the last few months have been particularly brutal. Depression hits me like a freight train sometimes, and this time it derailed me entirely. After one too many missed calls from my family and an offhand comment to my therapist about how I didn't see the point of any of this, I found myself admitted to a psychiatric hospital for a mandatory 3-day evaluation. The hospital, Riverview Behavioral Health, wasn't what I expected. I'd imagined something cold and sterile, all white walls and fluorescent lights. But Riverview was different. It was a long, gray building set on the edge of a dense forest, with windows so small they looked like they belonged on a medieval fortress. Inside, the walls were a sickly shade of pale green, as though someone thought it would be calming but got it catastrophically wrong. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something else, a faint, sour odor I couldn't place but didn't like. I checked in, surrendering my belt, shoelaces, and anything else deemed a risk. A nurse led me down a series of dimly lit hallways, her shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum. She stopped in front of a heavy wooden door with a scratched brass plate that read 203. "This will be your room," she said, her voice overly cheerful. "You'll be sharing it with a long-term patient. His name's Aaron. He's unique, but harmless." She opened the door and gestured for me to step inside. The room was small, with 2 twin beds pushed against opposite walls. The window was narrow and barred, and a single fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Aaron was sitting on the bed closest to the window, hunched over and muttering to himself. He was tall and lanky, with stringy brown hair that hung in his face. His hands were long and bony, and he was using them to twist and untwist the edge of his blanket. His lips moved rapidly, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. Aaron's head snapped up, and for a moment his dark eyes locked onto mine. They were wide and unblinking, with a strange intensity that made my skin crawl. He didn't respond, just went back to muttering and twisting the blanket. The nurse left, shutting the door behind her with a heavy thud. I stood there awkwardly for a moment before dropping my bag onto the bed. The mattress was thin and lumpy, and the pillow looked like it had been stuffed with shredded newspapers. I sighed and sat down, trying not to think about how much I didn't want to be here. The first few hours passed uneventfully. Aaron mostly ignored me, pacing the room and talking under his breath. I tried to tune him out, but his voice had a strange but rhythmic quality that made it hard to ignore. It was like he was chanting, but the words didn't make any sense. That night, I woke up to the sound of Aaron whispering. At first, I thought he was talking in his sleep, but when I opened my eyes, I saw him standing at the foot of my bed, staring down at me. "What the hell?" I said, sitting up quickly. Aaron didn't respond. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes wide and glassy. He tilted his head to one side, like a curious animal, and then slowly backed away to his bed. He climbed under the covers without a word, and within minutes he was snoring softly. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, things got worse. Aaron's muttering grew louder and more insistent, and I started to catch snippets of what he was saying. Most of it was gibberish, but every now and then a word or phrase would stand out. Shadows, the eyes, don't let them in. At one point, I tried to talk to him, hoping to make sense of whatever was going on in his head. "Hey Aaron," I said, keeping my tone light. "What's all that stuff you're talking about?" He stopped pacing and turned to look at me. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, in a low, raspy voice, he said, "They're watching us." "Who's watching us?" I asked, trying to sound more curious than alarmed. "The shadows," he said, his eyes darting around the room. "They hide in the corners, but they're always there, always watching. They like it when we're afraid." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't say anything. Aaron went back to pacing, his muttering picking up speed. That night was worse than the first. I woke up to the sound of Aaron laughing, a low, guttural chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. When I opened my eyes, I saw him crouched in the corner of the room, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlight outside. He was rocking back and forth, his hands clasped tightly around his knees. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They're here," he whispered, his eyes darting to the corners of the room. "They're always here at night. There's no one here but us." I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Aaron shook his head, a manic grin spreading across his face. You can't see them, but they're here. They like to watch. They like it when you're scared. I didn't sleep at all after that. By the third day, I was desperate to get out. I told the staff about Aaron's behavior, but they just nodded sympathetically and said he was harmless. He's just processing his trauma, one of the nurses said. He's not a danger to anyone. But I wasn't so sure. There was something about the way Aaron looked at me, like he was seeing something I couldn't, something terrible. That night, Aaron was quieter than usual. He sat on his bed, staring out the window with a vacant expression. I thought maybe he'd finally calmed down, but then he turned to me and said, "They're gonna take you tonight." "What?" I said, my heart pounding. "The shadows," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They like you. They've been watching you since you got here. They're going to take you." I wanted to tell him he was crazy, that he didn't know what he was talking about, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't shake the feeling that he believed what he was saying, and that made it worse. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my bed, staring at the corners of the room. The shadows seemed darker than usual, deeper, like they were alive. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was moving closer, creeping toward me. When morning finally came, I was a wreck. My hands were shaking and my chest felt tight. But when the nurse came to tell me I was being discharged, relief washed over me like a tidal wave. As I packed my things, Aaron watched me from his bed, a small, knowing smile on his lips. "Good luck out there," he said as I headed for the door. They don't always stay in the shadows. It's been 3 weeks since I left Riverview, and I haven't slept more than a few hours at a time. I don't know if Aaron was crazy or if he knew something I didn't. But every night as I sit awake in the dark, I can't help but wonder, what if he was right? Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. They always warned us about how things could go wrong on the night shift, but I never really believed them. Most nights at Ridgeview Psychiatric Facility were dull, just a lot of walking up and down hallways, staring at monitors, and signing logs. I liked the quiet, honestly. It gave me time to think, and I thought I'd seen it all after 6 months on the job. That night, though, everything I thought I knew about this place changed. It started around midnight during my first round. I was checking the high-risk ward, where the facility housed patients who needed the tightest security. These weren't just troubled people. They were the kind you read about in crime reports and horror stories. One of them was Patient 37. Everyone in the staff room called him the Shadow. It wasn't his real name, we weren't even told that, but it fit. He barely spoke, never reacted, and had this unnerving way of sitting perfectly still, like a mannequin. The only thing I knew for sure was that he wasn't allowed out of his room, ever. I paused outside his door during my rounds, checking the small observation window. He was awake, as usual, sitting on the edge of his bed. His hands were clasped in his lap, his eyes fixed on the far wall. His room was silent, sterile, just like every other night. I moved on, finished my rounds, and returned to the security room. It was small and cramped, with a desk covered in monitors showing black and white feeds from every corner of the facility. I scanned the screens, noting that everything seemed normal. Patient 37's room was quiet, the halls were empty, and the nurses on duty were chatting in the break room. Then the intercom crackled to life. "This is Nurse Kelly," a calm female voice said, "escorting patient 37 to medical for testing. Over." I sat up straight. Testing? At midnight? That was highly irregular. Patient 37 didn't leave his room, let alone for testing. I picked up the radio. "This is Josh in security. Testing at this hour? Can you confirm the authorization?" There was a pause, then confirmed, proceeding now. I checked the monitor for patient 37's room. A woman in scrubs had entered, clipboard in hand. She was standing just inside the doorway, speaking to him. He stood slowly, as if he were reluctant, and then followed her out of the room. The pit in my stomach grew. Something wasn't right. I switched camera feeds, tracking their progress. The nurse led him down the hallway toward the medical wing. I watched them turn a corner, her posture confident, his unnervingly calm. I grabbed the phone and called the nurse's station. Lisa, the head night nurse, answered. Lisa, who authorized testing for patient 37? What testing? She asked, her voice confused. A nurse just took him out of his room. She said it was for testing. There was a pause, then, Josh, no one scheduled anything for him tonight. His orders are clear. He doesn't leave that room without a full security team. Panic tightened in my chest. Lisa, she's already taken him to medical. I'll meet you there, she said quickly. I bolted from the security room, my boots echoing on the tile floor as I headed toward the medical wing. The hallways felt darker, more oppressive, and the air seemed colder. When I reached the medical wing, the lights were dim, and the door to the testing room was ajar. I pushed it open cautiously, my hand on the baton at my side. The room was empty. No nurse, no patient 37, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Lisa arrived moments later, her face pale. Are you sure they came here? I saw them on the cameras, I said, my voice tight. They walked down this hallway, I know they did. She grabbed a phone and called the on-call doctor. No one answered. I switched my radio to the emergency channel. This is Josh. We have an unauthorized movement of patient 37. Lock down all exits and secure the facility immediately. Alarms blared, the red emergency lights flashing through the hallways. Staff scrambled to secure doors and check on other patients. Back in the security room, I rewound the footage, watching as the nurse and patient 37 walked the halls. But then the feed cut out for 30 seconds, right as they were turning into the medical wing. When it resumed, the hallway was empty. How is that possible? Lisa whispered, staring over my shoulder. I didn't have an answer. We searched the entire building, every room, every corridor. There was no sign of patient 37 or the nurse. When the day shift arrived, we reviewed every log, every camera, but there was nothing to explain what had happened. The next day, I asked my supervisor about the nurse. He frowned, flipping through the staff directory. There's no one named Kelly on the night staff, he said. I stared at him, my mouth dry. Patient 37 was never found. And whoever Nurse Kelly was, she had keys to the facility and access to our most dangerous patient. To this day, I can't explain how she got in or what she wanted with him. All I know is that she wasn't one of us. My name is Daniel, and I've been a night shift nurse at Brookhaven Psychiatric Facility for nearly 3 years. It's not the kind of job people dream about growing up, but it suits me. Nights are usually quiet, just the hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional footsteps of a restless patient, and the comforting predictability of routine. Most nights, I can sip my coffee, do my rounds, and feel like I'm making a difference. But there was one night, one patient, that changed everything. It started at 11:45 p.m. I was finishing up my notes at the nurse's station, jotting down updates on medication schedules and behavior logs. The rest of the staff had gone home hours ago, leaving me and Rick, the security guard, to keep the place running. I liked Rick. He was a grizzled ex-cop with a no-nonsense attitude and a tendency to tell stories that made me laugh, even when I didn't want to. Hey, Danny, Rick called out from his post by the monitors. You checked on Davis yet? Davis, patient 309. The name alone sent a shiver down my spine. He was one of the newer admits, brought in a month ago after a violent altercation with a neighbor. Tall, wiry, and perpetually on edge, Davis had a way of staring through you, like he could see the worst parts of your soul. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was enough to make you think twice about working here. I'm about to, I replied, closing my notebook. Davis's room was in the East Wing, a quieter part of the facility where we kept high-risk patients. The hallway leading there always felt colder, the walls closer. I knocked lightly on his door, peering through the small observation window. The room was dark except for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the barred window. His bed was empty. My stomach tightened. Davis? I opened the door slowly, the faint creak of the hinges making my pulse quicken. The bed was neatly made, the thin mattress untouched. The room was silent, save for the distant hum of the ventilation system. I radioed Rick. Hey, Davis isn't in his room. Did you see anything on the cameras? There was a pause before Rick answered. Hang on, checking now. I stood in the doorway, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. It wasn't uncommon for patients to wander during the night, but Davis wasn't like most patients. He wasn't the type to meander in search of a midnight snack or a cigarette. If he was out of his room, there was a reason, and I doubted it was good. "Daniel," Rick's voice crackled through the radio, suddenly tense. "There's no footage of him leaving his room. The cameras in the East Wing went down about 30 minutes ago." "What?" My voice rose involuntarily. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I just noticed it now," Rick replied, his tone defensive. "Stay where you are. I'll come to you." But I didn't stay put. I couldn't. Something about the emptiness of Davis's room gnawed at me, a quiet dread that urged me to move, to find him before he found someone else. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the linoleum floor. The shadows seemed to stretch longer here, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly. I checked the nearby rooms, empty. The common area, empty. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Then I saw it. A piece of paper, folded neatly and left on the floor in front of the supply closet. My heart pounded as I picked it up, unfolding it with shaking hands. The handwriting was scrawled and uneven, the kind that looked like it had been carved into the paper with a dull pencil. "Stop looking for me, Nurse Danny." I froze. My first instinct was to laugh it off as some twisted coincidence, but the truth was glaring. He'd written this for me. He knew I'd be the one to find it. "Rick," I said into the radio, my voice barely above a whisper. "I found a note. He's messing with us." "Where are you now?" "Supply closet, East Wing." "Stay there. I'm coming." The next few minutes felt like hours. Every sound, the distant creak of the building settling, the faint hum of the lights, felt amplified, like it was happening right next to me. My palms were sweating, my breathing shallow. I wasn't scared of Davis, not exactly. I was scared of what he might be planning. Rick finally arrived, his flashlight cutting through the dim corridor. He was holding a baton, his expression grim. "Let's check the closet," he said. I nodded, stepping aside as he opened the door. Inside, shelves of medical supplies lined the walls, neatly organized, but there was no sign of Davis. "Damn it," Rick muttered, slamming the door shut. "He's playing games." We decided to split up. Rick would check the West Wing, and I'd continue searching the East. Part of me wanted to argue, to stay together, but I didn't. I think a part of me wanted to prove I wasn't afraid, even if it was a lie. I moved cautiously, peering into every room, checking every corner. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like metal scraping against metal. It was coming from the maintenance corridor, a narrow passageway we rarely used. My heart raced as I approached the door. It was slightly ajar, the light inside flickering weakly. I pushed it open, my flashlight sweeping the room. There he was. Davis was crouched in the corner, his back to me, working intently on something I couldn't see. His head tilted slightly as I stepped closer, like he was listening for my movements. "Davis," I said, keeping my voice steady, "you need to come with me." He didn't respond. I took another step, and that's when I saw it, a jagged piece of metal in his hand, glinting in the faint light. He was scratching something onto the wall, the words crude and uneven. "They're watching you." My stomach dropped. Davis put the metal down. He turned slowly, his face blank but his eyes sharp, calculating. For a moment, neither of us moved, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. Then, without a word, he dropped the metal and stood up, his lanky frame towering over me. He raised his hands, a gesture of surrender, but the way he smiled made my skin crawl. "Lead the way, Nurse Danny," he said, his voice low and calm. I didn't trust that smile, not for a second. We walked back to his room in silence, the halls eerily quiet. Rick was waiting for us when we arrived, relief flooding his face. Together, we secured Davis in his room, double-checking the locks. But even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something, that the game wasn't over. Later that night, I found another note slipped under the door of the nurse's station. "It's not over," and I believed him.